They said I was too dramatic until the wedding. DJ played the voicemail from his secret wife. I was barely 2 minutes away from cutting the wedding cake when the DJ tapped the microphone, cleared his throat, and told the crowd he had a very special audio message for the groom. My stomach clenched in an instant. I don't know if it was some intuitive flash of dread or just plain nerves, but I felt a chill roll through me. The music cut out, and everyone in the ballroom went quiet. Brian, my brand new husband, looked as if he'd seen a ghost. I remember glancing at his face, then around at the rows of guests. My mother Linda pressing her hands together in excitement. My father Mark watching curiously. I told myself it must be some sweet, last-minute surprise from an old friend. But the second the woman's voice poured out of the speakers, raw with pain and anger, I realized everything I'd been worried about for the past few months was about to come crashing down in the most public, devastating way possible. "Hey, Brian," the woman said, her tone trembling with what sounded like both fury and heartbreak. "I don't know what game you're playing right now, standing at the altar with some other woman, but I'm still your wife. You promised me we'd fix our marriage. You promised me we wouldn't give up. And now you're doing this?" A collective gasp rippled through the guests. My mother's jaw literally dropped. My father looked like he was about to charge forward and rip the DJ's equipment out of the wall, and I stood there in my sparkly white dress, my fingertips going numb around the bouquet. In that moment, I understood with painful clarity that I wasn't just being dramatic, as so many people had insisted. I wasn't just paranoid. All those tiny red flags I'd collected in my head, late-night phone calls, weird reactions, strange disappearances, were validated in one thunderous blow. Up until then, I'd hoped I was wrong. I'd hoped I was overthinking, letting my emotions get the best of me. But that woman's voice, echoing through the speakers, shattered every comforting lie I'd told myself. The rest of the message dissolved into static as the DJ fumbled to stop the playback, leaving the entire room in stunned, suffocating silence. And I, Amy Rogers, newlywed and supposed drama queen, had to decide what the hell I was going to do about the fact that my husband apparently had a secret wife. To explain how I got to that surreal moment, shaking in front of 200 wedding guests, I need to go back months. Actually, close to a year. That's when I met Brian. I was the single friend at my coworker's birthday, the one nursing a glass of white wine at a rooftop bar in Chicago, while everyone else chatted in little clusters. I'm not naturally shy, but I can be intense when I get excited about something, and I'd been burned in the past by guys who found my enthusiasm off-putting. So I was standing there, taking in the skyline, when Brian approached me with a confident smile. He told me he liked my shoes, these vintage black heels with gold clasps. It was such a random compliment that I laughed and said something awkward like, "Thanks, I got them at a flea market." There was an immediate spark, though, because he started talking about how he loved hidden gems around the city and enjoyed going to quirky vintage shops on the weekends. Before I knew it, I was telling him all about my hobby refinishing old furniture and my obsession with estate sales. We hit it off fast. By the end of the night, he'd asked for my number, and I'd given it without a second thought. For once, I didn't feel the usual pang of social anxiety telling me to run away. He texted me the next day, no 3-day waiting period or any of that nonsense. We met for coffee at a little indie cafe near my apartment in Logan Square. My best friend Rachel teased me that I looked too excited for a second date, but I couldn't help it. Brian was sweet, funny, outgoing. He had that charming habit of asking me tons of questions, listening intently, and then following up. Like, if I mentioned I was anxious about an upcoming meeting at work, he'd message me right after it was over to see how I was doing. I remember thinking, finally, here's a guy who doesn't mind that I'm a bundle of big feelings. I do have a reputation for being emotional. My parents always joked that I felt everything at a volume of 11. If I was happy, I glowed. If I was upset, I cried buckets. Rachel once joked that I was the kind of person who'd see two squirrels playing in a park and tear up because it was so cute. Over time, I learned to dial it back so I wouldn't scare people away. That's partly why I was so swept up by how Brian embraced my intensity. He teased me about it, lightly, but he never acted like it was a negative trait, at least not at first. We officially started dating a few weeks after that first coffee date. By midsummer, we were practically inseparable. He'd bring me flowers just because it was a Tuesday. He said he loved my passion for crafting, for vintage clothes, for random late-night drives along the lakefront. I'd never felt so seen and appreciated. Looking back, though, little inconsistencies began popping up even then. He'd get texts late at night that he'd swipe away instantly saying, "Oh, it's just my boss," or "just some spam call." Sometimes I'd notice him withdrawing into himself after these messages, but whenever I asked, he brushed it off. I'd think, am I overreacting? Or should I just let him have his space? Everyone in my life always told me I was prone to blowing stuff out of proportion, so I tried my best to ignore that knot in my stomach. One night, I was at his apartment, this sleek one-bedroom in a nice high-rise near the river, when I happened to see an envelope on his kitchen counter with a name I didn't recognize. Julia Pierce. It wasn't Brian's name, obviously, and the address matched his place. I asked, "Hey, who's Julia Pierce? Is that your landlord?" He looked almost comically startled, then said, "Oh, that's an old roommate who never updated her mailing address." I remember thinking, a roommate? In this tiny one-bedroom? But I figured maybe he was subleasing or had some arrangement. Instead of pressing, I told myself I was being ridiculous. In the back of my head, though, a quiet alarm bell rang. Fast forward another couple months, and Brian proposed. That might sound crazy fast, and it was, but he sold me on the idea that when you know, you know. He got down on one knee at a small family gathering on Thanksgiving Day. My mom squealed. Rachel jumped up and down, and I was so overwhelmed by the romance of the moment that I said yes. My dad, Mark, patted Brian on the back with a proud grin, saying, "Welcome to the family, son." Everyone was so caught up in the excitement that I almost convinced myself I was too. But a tiny corner of my mind was still uneasy, fixated on the mysterious mail for Julia Pierce, the late-night messages, the random business trips he'd mentioned last minute. You might wonder, why didn't I ask more questions? Well, the truth is, anytime I so much as hinted at concerns, I got the same response from Brian. "You worry too much," or "You're just letting your imagination go wild." And since I'd heard that same line from so many people my entire life, I bought into it. Plus, he was so thoughtful in every other way. It felt easier to believe him than to risk blowing up a perfectly good relationship. If you ask anyone who's ever doubted themselves, you'll understand it's easier to push the fear aside than face the possibility that your entire reality might be a lie. Once wedding planning kicked into high gear, I was drowning in tasks. My mother basically turned into a full-time wedding planner, booking venue tours, scheduling cake tastings, picking out invitations. Brian always seemed enthusiastic at first, but as time went on, he started avoiding the planning sessions. He'd claim he had urgent deadlines at work or that something came up with his family in another state. He was from Ohio originally, so that part didn't ring too suspicious, except it happened more often than I'd expect. Rachel noticed the pattern before I did. She commented, "It's weird that Brian's never around for these decisions. Don't you think that's odd, given how excited he was to propose?" I tried to shrug it off. "He's just busy," I told her. "You know how it is. I can't always be the paranoid one." But the seed of doubt was planted again. A couple of his friends from out of town showed up one weekend, and we all went out for drinks together. I think their names were Evan and Jason. They'd known Brian for years, supposedly from college, though I'd never met them before. At one point, when Brian went to the restroom, I asked them how it felt to see their buddy about to get married. They exchanged a look, one of those quick glances that screams something is off, but they just laughed and said, "We're happy for him, though it did all happen pretty fast." Then they changed the subject. My gut clenched again. Even so, I couldn't bring myself to dig deeper. I felt like if I peeled back that layer, I'd unleash a storm. I was too invested in the wedding to risk that. And I know how that sounds. Like I was so desperate to get married that I ignored glaring danger signs. It wasn't exactly that. It was more like I didn't trust my own instincts enough to confront him. Because everyone in my life always labeled me as the emotional one, the drama queen, the girl who can't keep calm. I tried so hard to show them I could be stable, rational, and easygoing. So when the red flags popped up, I told myself I was simply being overdramatic. The morning of our wedding day, I woke up with an odd sense of panic clawing at my chest. My mother and Rachel were in the bridal suite, helping me with my makeup, my hair, the beaded dress that cost me a fortune. The room was filled with that excited buzz you expect on a wedding day, but inside I was shaking. I tried to calm myself by thinking, this is probably just the typical wedding jitters everyone talks about. My mother stroked my arm and whispered, "Amy, you look so beautiful. Today is going to be perfect. Don't let those silly nerves get in the way." I forced a smile. When Brian texted me a simple, "Hey babe, can't wait to see you," I stared at the words, hoping for some reassurance. The rational part of me insisted, he's not a monster. He's the man who brings you coffee in bed, who learned all the names of your coworkers just to make conversation easier at parties. But that sense of dread never fully left. Fast forward a few hours later, and we were married in a ceremony that felt almost dreamlike. I remember standing at the altar, candles flickering all around, Brian's hands wrapped around mine, and I kept thinking, he looks so normal. He even teared up as he read his vows, swearing he'd love me forever, protect me, cherish me. In that moment, I think I allowed myself to melt into the romance. Maybe I was being naive, or maybe I just wanted so badly to believe in the fairy tale. We exchanged rings and the entire room erupted in cheers. Then we headed into the reception. The fancy dinner, the speeches, the first dance. Everything felt surreal, like I was floating. My father gave a heartfelt toast, welcoming Brian into our family. Rachel cracked jokes about all the weird, embarrassing phases of my life. Brian's best man told a story about how Brian once pulled an all-nighter to help a friend in crisis. If there were tension lines on Brian's face, I didn't notice them at that point. It was only as the dinner plates were being cleared that I saw him slip away to take a phone call. I followed him with my eyes. He pressed his phone to his ear, pacing near the coat check, looking agitated. Then he disappeared behind a door. I felt a twinge of alarm, but people were calling me over for more photos, so I forced myself to stay put. That's the moment the DJ announced he had a surprise for the groom, a special audio message from someone who couldn't be here tonight. I remember how he made it sound like it was going to be a cute cameo from a distant relative or an old friend. Brian stepped back into the room just as the DJ was speaking, his expression tense. He shook his head as if wanting to stop the DJ, but it was too late. The track began to play. For a second, all we heard was rustling, like the phone had been dropped. Then a woman's voice began, thick with emotion. "Brian, I'm not sure if this is actually going to get played at your wedding, but if it does, I want everyone to know who you really are. I can't believe you're standing there with another woman after everything we said. After we agreed to try again." She trailed off, and I heard her sniff back tears. "And in case you're wondering who I am, I'm Julia. Your wife, legally, still your wife." That single line froze my entire body, like someone had poured ice water down my spine. I felt my grip on the bouquet loosen. People started glancing from Brian to me and back again. A few gasps echoed across the room. My mother covered her mouth, horrified. "She's lying," Brian muttered, stepping toward the DJ booth, but the message kept playing. "You promised me last month that we'd get marriage counseling, that you'd come back to Ohio to talk to me in person. Then you ghosted me. I found out from a friend you were actually planning a wedding in Chicago. I'm trying to hold it together for our child." Suddenly the audio cut off with a burst of static. The DJ must have panicked and yanked the plug. People looked around, half expecting more. But that was it. The shocking revelation was out in the open. Brian stared at me with wide eyes, as if silently begging me not to believe what I just heard. My legs felt weak, like they might buckle beneath me. A stunned hush took hold of the entire ballroom. Then chaos descended. Some of the guests started whispering or shouting questions. My father stood up, his fists clenched. Rachel ran to my side, saying my name over and over. I just remember standing there, heart pounding, thinking, this can't be real. I can't be the woman who's unknowingly married to someone who already has a wife. Brian tried to grab my hand, but I jerked away. "What the hell is going on?" I demanded, my voice shaking. He kept saying, "I can explain. She's my ex. We've been separated for a long time." People were huddled around us, listening with eyes like saucers. The DJ, his face red as a tomato, apologized, stumbling over words, insisting he had no idea what was on that audio. My father was livid. He roared, "I want an explanation now, Brian. Are you or are you not still legally married?" Everyone's eyes landed on Brian as if he were a defendant on trial. He tried to stammer out that the divorce was nearly finalized. It was just delayed by paperwork, that Julia was being vindictive. But the damage was done. One or two of his friends had the decency to look guilty, as if they knew parts of this. My mother was sobbing, big tears rolling down her cheeks as she apologized to me over and over for ever doubting my suspicions. I felt like someone had scooped out my insides. Anger, betrayal, heartbreak. They all collided at once and I couldn't breathe. I ripped off my veil, tossing it to the floor. I remember my father stepping between Brian and me, practically daring him to come closer. The guests started dispersing, some murmuring that they were sorry, that they had no idea this was going on. Within minutes, the wedding reception of my dreams turned into a mass exodus. Tables were abandoned, the open bar left deserted. A few people still lingered to watch the drama unfold, because that's human nature. I managed to slip away to a small side hallway, with Rachel following behind me. She kept asking if I was okay, if I needed water, if I was going to pass out. I pressed my back against the wall and slid down onto the floor, my dress pooling around me, tears running down my face. "Oh my God, Rach," I kept saying. "He actually has a wife? A wife and maybe a kid?" It was too surreal. My best friend knelt next to me, hugging me, reassuring me this wasn't my fault. But all I could think was how I'd ignored every red flag, every instinct that told me something was seriously off. Brian tried to come after me, but my father blocked him, telling him to back the hell away until we sorted this out. I heard them shouting in the hallway. Part of me wanted to confront Brian then and there, to demand a full confession. Another part of me wanted to vanish, to pretend the last 6 months hadn't happened. Eventually, the wedding planner came over, looking as though she'd just stumbled into a murder scene. She whispered that some guests were gathering in the lobby, not sure if they should leave or if we'd continue the reception. I let out a humorless laugh. Continue the reception? After that bombshell? Absolutely not. I don't know how much time passed before Brian managed to corner me, away from my father's watchful eye. He started spewing excuses, that he and Julia were basically done, but she refused to sign the final papers, that he'd been trying to protect me from the drama, that he was scared I'd call off the wedding if I knew. We've been separated for a year, Amy, he insisted. We just never filed the final paperwork. It's complicated. I watched him, noticing how he couldn't even look me straight in the eye. My chest felt tight, and I wondered if I might faint. You lied, I whispered, over and over. He reached for my hand and I yanked it back. Don't, I hissed. Just don't. See? By then, my father showed up again, telling Brian to leave me alone. People were filming with their phones. I guess the gossip potential was too strong to resist. Brian looked humiliated. But what about me? I was the bride who just discovered in front of everyone that her husband wasn't even legally free to marry. It took all my willpower not to scream and break down right there. But I'd always been called dramatic. So ironically, I was determined not to give everyone more ammunition. Eventually, my father escorted me out of the venue. My mother came with us sobbing quietly. Rachel gathered my things, my purse, my phone, the overnight bag for the honeymoon suite we'd booked. I left Brian behind, surrounded by confusion and condemnation from the few guests who remained. The next thing I knew, we were in my parents' car, heading back to their suburban house with me still in my wedding dress. The following hours and days were a whirlwind. Brian texted me apologies, claiming he was going to get everything sorted out with Julia immediately, that she was just vengeful because he wanted the divorce but she didn't. I didn't reply at first. I couldn't face him, couldn't handle another lie. Rachel stayed with me that first night, and I don't think either of us slept more than an hour. My phone blew up with messages from people who'd heard what happened. Some supportive, some downright nosy, wanting details. I shut it all out. I did, however, get a call from a number I didn't recognize. It turned out to be Julia. She was crying, telling me she was sorry I found out this way, and that she'd been desperate to expose Brian's deception because he refused to be honest. Apparently, they'd been married for 2 years, separated for the last 6 months, and he'd told her he needed space to think things through. When she found out he was engaged to me, she felt betrayed and blindsided. She had no idea he'd moved on so completely. I just listened, numb, while my stomach twisted itself in knots. She said they did have a child, a daughter, 2 years old, and that Brian had left them both in Ohio. I remember holding the phone, tears burning my eyes, whispering, "He never told me. Not about you, not about your daughter." She broke down sobbing, and I realized just how many lives Brian had entangled with his lies. Over the next few weeks, I struggled through the legal mess. Since my so-called marriage to Brian was invalid, we had to start the process of annulling it. My father hired a lawyer who specialized in family law. Meanwhile, Brian bombarded me with messages, insisting we could fix it if I'd only give him a chance. But the more he tried to explain, the bigger the pit in my stomach grew. He said yes, he and Julia were legally still married, but they'd been functionally separated. He never told me because he didn't want to lose me. In other words, he decided to string both me and Julia along until he figured out which life he preferred. The emotional fallout was almost unbearable. I'd wake up in the middle of the night crying, reliving that moment when the DJ played her voice in front of everyone I knew. I felt humiliated, angry, furious with Brian, and angry at myself for not trusting my gut. My parents, especially my mom, kept apologizing to me, saying, "We just thought you were overthinking again. We never imagined he was lying to you about something this huge." Rachel hovered around me protectively, refusing to even say Brian's name because she was so mad at him. Word spread fast. Some mutual acquaintances took pity on me, while others seemed to relish the drama, as if it were an episode of a reality show. A video snippet of the actual voicemail playing at my wedding even made its way online, though it was quickly taken down when I threatened to sue anyone who kept distributing it. It felt like a horrible fever dream, but it was my real life. Eventually, I decided I needed closure. I met with Brian one last time, in a neutral space, a law office actually, so we could talk about the annulment paperwork. He tried again to apologize, tears in his eyes, saying he was just a coward who couldn't face me with the truth. I asked if he'd really meant to finalize the divorce with Julia. He swore he had the papers ready, and that she was the one delaying things, but By then I knew better. Even if that was partially true, it didn't excuse months of lying and letting me plan a wedding while he was still legally tied to someone else. I remember looking at him, feeling nothing but a hollow sense of betrayal. When he reached for my hand, I pulled away. I told him, I might be dramatic, but at least I'm honest. I can't share my life with someone who lies so easily. And that was that. The annulment process took a while, but in the end our marriage was wiped off the legal records, as though it never happened. Brian moved back to Ohio. I heard from a friend that he was trying to mend fences with Julia for the sake of their daughter, but I don't know if that's really true. Meanwhile, I holed up in my parents' house for a couple of months, licking my wounds, grieving the future I'd pictured so vividly. Some days I felt devastated. Other days I was enraged. But slowly, I started to piece myself back together. Rachel, bless her, forced me to go out for coffee or walks by the lake. She reminded me constantly that none of this was my fault, that I'd been lied to in the most awful way. My mom insisted on therapy, so I saw a counselor who specialized in betrayal trauma. She helped me see that my emotional side, the part people labeled dramatic, was the same part that could have protected me if I'd trusted it. I realized I'd spent so many years being told to tone myself down that I ended up ignoring my best defense mechanism, my gut feeling. Now, months after the fiasco, I'm back in my own apartment in Chicago trying to move on. My father gave me money from the refunded catering fees. Yes, we managed to get some of our wedding expenses back, so I could buy a few new pieces of furniture and redecorate. I'm reinventing my space and hopefully my outlook on relationships. I still have nightmares sometimes about standing in that reception hall, hearing the DJ's voice, and then that other woman's sobs bursting out of the speakers, unraveling my life in mere seconds. But each day, it gets a little easier to breathe. I've gone on a few dates since then, though nothing serious. I'm honest with people I meet about what happened, at least in broad strokes. I say, I was engaged to someone who turned out to be legally married. Saul. Most people respond with shock and sympathy, but I don't let it define me. If anything, it taught me never to ignore my instincts again. And if a future partner calls me too emotional or tries to shame me for being attuned to red flags, I'll consider that an immediate sign they're not right for me. It's funny how people talk about big wedding dramas, like it's the stuff of soap operas. But let me tell you, living it is 1,000 times worse. The embarrassment alone could swallow you whole, especially when it blows up on social media. Yet looking back, I wouldn't trade knowing the truth for staying in the dark. I'd rather have found out at the wedding than 6 months or a year down the road, or after having a child with him. Still, it's not a memory I'd wish on my worst enemy. So that's it. That's how I learned I was never actually his wife in the eyes of the law because he already had one. They called me dramatic for suspecting something was off, told me to stop overthinking. But in the end, my gut feelings were spot on. I don't see it as a flaw anymore. I see it as a sign that I needed to learn to trust myself. And if there's a silver lining to the entire disaster, it's that I'll never again let someone talk me out of my own intuition. Because no matter how much it hurts to face a painful truth, it hurts a whole lot more to plan a wedding with someone who's building their life on lies.